Hello everyone, it's 4 o'clock, so it's time to start the webinar. Welcome to this webinar organized by Language Partners. I'm Carola, I work at the L&D team at Language Partners and help to organize this webinar. My colleague Virginia will start talking about miscommunication in business English in a minute. But before we start, just a few things to remember. Please keep your camera and microphone turned off. There will be 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions. So please save any questions you may have during the webinar to the end. At that time, you can post comments and questions in the chat. During the presentation, the trainer will use a poll and she'll also ask questions that you can answer in the chat. If you haven't found the chat yet, it's at the bottom of your screen. You can click on chat and it will pop up. In case you have any technical issues, you can contact the Language Partners Help Desk. Their email and phone number was in the email you received an hour ago. Now I'd like to use Virginia Nillison. She's worked as a teacher and trainer for 11 years and joined Language Partners in 2012. Over the past 6 years, she has focused mainly on giving business English training as well as becoming a member of the L&D team. In her L&D role, she has worked on developing various English materials as well as coaching and mentoring other trainers. Virginia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I saw in the chat that a few of you said that it was quite quiet, so hopefully you can all hear me okay. So I will now go over to the presentation. Okay, so yeah, before we start, let's just have a quick look through what's on the agenda today. So we've just had the welcome and introduction. We will be following that up with a self-reflection. So basically, we'll be looking at the differences between the Dutch culture and language and the English culture and language. We will then move on to cultural sensitivity, so indirect versus direct communication styles. We will have a look at diplomatic and polite language, and I've split that up into two. So the first one is using modals, can, could, would. And the second one is what we call softening language or hedging language. And then we will do a summary of what was covered. And as Carola said, there'll be plenty of time at the end to ask any questions, and then we'll wrap up. So more and more of us are working in an international work environment, whether that's communicating with our non-natives in English in the Benelux, for example, or internationally with native speakers in the US. Now, each type of communication is, of course, very different. For example, if you're talking to a non-native speaker, you might find a misunderstanding occurs because your level of English is slightly higher or lower than the other person. So perhaps there's a confusion because of you're using the wrong word or vocabulary, or maybe using the wrong grammatical structure. On the other hand, of course, speaking with native speakers is also quite challenging. Maybe they speak very fast, or they have a strong accent, or of course, they could also just use very complicated words. Now, unfortunately, there is no quick fix for these situations that you might find yourself in. Often the best way is to solve these problems in the moment. So to ask for clarification and repetition to basically check that you understand one another. You can, for example, use phrases like, do you mean? Or, sorry, I don't quite follow you. And for repetition, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you repeat that? Now, I think if you've already built up a good relationship with someone, asking for more information and saying you don't understand shouldn't feel too awkward, as long as you do it politely and clearly, of course. In fact, this is the real secret to building and maintaining good relationships at work. whether it's your first contact with a client or a new colleague, or if you've been talking or working with somebody for a long time. So using the right tone and level of politeness can really make the difference between successfully communicating your message and time wasted trying to explain yourself again, or having to apologize because you came across as rude or even demanding. So before we look at how we can apply the right language in a business English environment, it's really important to look at how your own culture, or look at your own culture, and for many of us, I think that is the Netherlands, so where you work and live. So what are the big differences then for us between the Dutch culture and language and the English culture and language? So at this stage, we can just think of the English language as all native English countries. So UK, Britain, Australia, etc. The US, I meant to say, not the UK. So yeah, please post your ideas. What for you are the big differences between the Dutch culture and language and the English culture and language? Okay. Yeah, I've got here, we're more direct, rude. Well, okay. Dutch words, it's very direct. Yeah, indeed. More use of the word please in the English language, where we do apologize a lot. Quite true. And yeah, ask politely for things with please. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm seeing quite a lot of, like I say, the directness, I think, is coming back quite often. Yeah, okay. Yeah, would you? Ah, very interesting. Yeah, well, good point. We'll come back to that one. That's could you? Excellent, excellent. Yeah. Now, I think we can all agree that the main difference that we feel between the two cultures and language is the level of directness. But before we look at that, you might see that I actually referred to language and culture together. Now, I think we can all agree that language plays a big part in shaping culture and vice versa. So through language, we communicate our beliefs, our values, and of course, we build relationships. And I think this idea is really nicely summed up in this quote by the Afghan-born American novelist Khaled Hosseini. He says, if culture was a house, then language was the key to the front door and to all the rooms in the house, or all the rooms inside. Okay, so I think we've established that generally speaking, Dutch is direct in its communication style. And in comparison, English is indirect in its communication style. Now, of course, within a country, there are also different ways of communicating or levels of directness from north to south and east to west. We won't look at that today. I think that's for another time. So we'll just be concentrating on countries and cultures as a whole. Okay, so I'd like to hear from you again. So before we move on to looking at these different kinds of communication styles, so direct as opposed to indirect, I'd like to ask you how many of you have experienced a form of miscommunication because of cultural difference? So do tell me, please post any experiences you've had in the chat. So how many of you have experienced some form of miscommunication because of a cultural difference? That can be at work or in your, in your private life. No differences. Even on holiday, perhaps. Okay. Oh, yeah. In expectations. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, indeed, what you expect from one another. That's a very good point. Yeah. Same for here. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. What do you expect from one another? Difficult questions, are we aware of? Yeah. Reflect it, yeah. Ah, that's really interesting. That's a really interesting point about, yeah, China. And I think especially Chinese and Dutch or English culture, yeah, is quite different. And definitely, indeed, the level of expectations, but also, maybe they say yes instead of no, or vice versa. So, well, I think we can all agree that miscommunication can occur at any time, and actually often it happens with our nearest and dearest. So I mean with our friends and family, but we're going to just concentrate on work experiences today. So as I mentioned before, the people you communicate in English with may be a non-native speaker. So their level of English may be quite low. So does this mean that we don't really need to worry about the right kind of English or using the right kind of English? So isn't it better just to be clear? Well, of course, yours and the person you're talking to's level of English is important to consider. But I think there is no point in using complicated language if that person can't understand you. However, I think it's also important not to get into bad habits where you just use basic language. So basic language is also called imperative language. And this can sound very demanding and sometimes forceful. So an example of that you can see there on the screen, answer the phone. So very clear, but can come across as forceful or demanding. So I think really, and this, I will come back to this point throughout the whole webinar, you really need to find the balance between being clear and polite. And often that's really thinking about the person you're talking to, or as we've seen in the chat there, what you expect from one another. I think it's also important to think about the fact that if you're using English in the workplace, then both you and the person you're communicating with are on a language journey. So I think getting into bad habits by using unprofessional language is really not advisable. Okay, so we looked a little bit earlier about direct and indirect. So yeah, I think what's even more important when you're communicating is not just to consider if that person is a non-native or a native speaker, but also what is their communication style. So let's take a closer look at that now. So an indirect communication style, these are just some examples of cultures with an indirect communication style. So Japan, Belgium, Britain are some examples of that. So I think we can all agree that there's a big cultural difference between Asian cultures like Japan and cultures like Belgium and Britain. However, all of these cultures have an indirect communication style. So if this person or a person from one of these countries were to get a voicemail like this, "Hi, it's Jackie. We need to talk. Call me when you're back in the office. Bye." Potentially, that could really have a negative effect. If they really didn't know the context, they may feel that they've done something wrong, or they might worry unnecessarily. A better alternative to a voicemail would be, "Hi, Jackie here. Could you give me a call as soon as you're back in the office? Speak to you soon. Thanks." Slightly longer, but I think we can all agree has a very different feel in tone. Now, in comparison, you might be communicating with a culture who actually appreciates a more direct approach. And some examples of those cultures are Germans, Americans, and Australians. So when I say direct, I mean they appreciate you being clear and not saying yes when we mean no. And that was brought up by somebody earlier in the chat. And that's really important. So for these kind of people, phrases like, "Well, I'm not really sure if I can make it to the meeting next week, Jackie," are pretty unhelpful and quite vague, especially when you know you are not going to the meeting. So you would actually probably be better saying something like, "Well, I'm afraid I won't be able to make it to the meeting next week, Jackie." Now, as I mentioned before, direct communication styles don't necessarily mean that they would respond well to the voicemail we saw earlier in the first example. And they wouldn't really respond very well to, "I'm not coming to the meeting next week, Jackie." So again, you can be clear, but polite. I think if we think about the Americans as well, I'm sure everybody knows the Americans world over for their politeness, especially when it comes to working with customers and clients. And how about the Germans? Another direct communication style, And yet in Germany, the organizational culture in a company is hierarchical. So respecting your superiors and addressing or speaking to colleagues and clients appropriately is very important. So in short, you can be clear, polite, and diplomatic while communicating with different cultures. But obviously, you may have to adapt how you say things or the level of how you say things. As we mentioned before, it's not just a one-way thing. Obviously, communication is a two-way path, and it's also important to understand who you're speaking to. So maybe they are saying yes when they mean no. So to recap, the key to good intercultural communication is understanding your own culture and being aware of the differences with others. So how does all this translate into the English language? Well, I think before we answer that question, it may be a good idea to just very quickly have a look at the language itself, so how we understand English. So I would say, generally speaking, that English is a descriptive language. So what I mean by that, it has a lot of words or synonyms. So there are many, many ways of saying the same thing. It can be seen as being succinct. And what I mean by that is, due to the fact there's lots of words, you can really say how you feel or what you think in just a few words. So I'll give you a little example of that. The word dog, you can see there are so many different synonyms and ways of referring to a dog, like doggy, hound, mongrel, bow wow, etc., etc. On the other hand, the English language has also extra words. So we have what we call helping words, or verbs rather. And some examples of that are, I am working at home at the moment. So am is a helping verb, and working is the main verb. Or I have worked for the company for 3 years, or I don't like coffee. By the way, modals also come into this group of language helping verbs, but we'll come back to that a bit later. So basically, all of this really influences the way the language is created or formed. So the words we choose to use or not use can therefore have a big influence on tone, or in other words, how diplomatic or polite we sound. Okay, so let's really get into the language now. So we've looked at cultural sensitivity, and we had a quick look at the English language. And obviously we've also covered thinking about our own culture and our communication style. So now we're going to have a look at some examples. So I've got a basic email that I'd like to share with you. So before we look at it, on the left-hand side, we see how Sandra comes across to her colleague when she writes an email to him. And on the right-hand side, you will see how Sandra wants to come across to her colleague, James. I'll just give you a little bit of background. So Sandra is emailing James. She's really strapped for time. So I mean, she hasn't got much time and is actually quite stressed out. Her colleagues are on holiday, another colleague's on maternity leave. So she really wants to just write a very quick email to James. By the way, James comes from the UK. Okay, so on the left-hand side, when do you want the report? Tomorrow or at the end of the week, Sandra? And actually, this is how she would have preferred to come across. Hi, James, how are you? Could you let me know when you would like the report? I can get it to you tomorrow, but I'd really appreciate a bit more time. So at the end of the week, regards, Sandra. Now, obviously, the second one is longer, but it's really not that much longer. So you can see the difference, I hope, in tone. Well, actually, tell me, what differences do you see? So again, in the chat, please type any phrases or words you see that changes the tone or the feel of this email. definitely the personal touch. Yeah, it's just a simple question. How are you? It's a nice way to open an email. Could, would. Yeah, excellent. Regards, indeed, a nice way to finish off. Yeah, could you? Very good. Yeah, indeed. And as you can see there by this next slide, I've highlighted those modals. That's what they're called: the could, the would, and the can. So there are other phrases that really turn this email around, but this is the group we're going to have a little look at now. So this group of words is a really important group. They're called modal verbs. And as I mentioned earlier, they are helping or auxiliary verbs. And we use them in combination with another main verb. So modal verbs have many, many functions. They can be used to make a polite request, to ask for something, to suggest something, to ask for permission, so to be allowed to do something or not. They can also express ideas such as ability, am I able or are you able to do something or not, as well as obligation. So if you're allowed to do something or not. And they can also be used for probability. So will something happen, probably happen or not. So modals verbs are really useful in business English. Yeah, from a positive, polite request like, could I have a coffee, please? To expressing your opinion in a meeting, like, I'm afraid I can't agree with that. Or just simply a politer way of saying something. I mean, I want the report by Friday. No, rather, I would like the report by Friday. And earlier we saw another example of ability, and that was, I can get it to you tomorrow. That was with regards to the email. So there are lots of different modals in the English language with lots of functions. And as we've just seen, some of them have a bit of a crossover as well, but they have nearly the same function. As you can see at the top of my sliding scale, we're just seeing these modals in the function of requesting or asking for something. So at the top, we have an incredibly polite way of asking or requesting something, which may be, may or might I take next Friday off. So may or might have next Friday off. In the middle, we have could and can and would like. And at the very bottom, we have the more extreme version. Well, it's not really a request. You're telling someone, I must or I have to have next Friday off. Now, I think really the most important thing to remember here is to meet in the middle. So in this sliding scale, it's literally in the middle. So you've got some options. You've got, could I take next Friday off? That's seen as a formal and preferred request. You've got, can I take next Friday off? So the can is less formal, but it's still a request. And then I'd like to take next Friday off. It's not a request, but it's still very polite. Okay, so let's now take a quick look at how we use modals in other examples. So we're going to have a look now at how modals, again, make you sound more polite and diplomatic. So have that in mind as we go through. I've got a couple of sentences. The first sentence is very, very direct, and I'd like you at home or wherever you are to just try to think of how to make that sound a little bit softer, a bit more polite. So try to use those modals. This time, don't put them in the chat. Just think for yourself. Maybe you want to write it down quickly, but just have a little think for yourself. So the first one. Tell me what you think, Sam. I'd like to hear what you think, Sam. Obviously, there are different options. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here as what you could say. I want more time. Better put, I could do with more time, or it would be helpful to have more time? Give me an answer by tomorrow. Could you give me an answer by tomorrow? This will delay the end of the project. This might delay the end of the project. Okay, I think in the last one you can see, or you could argue or say that that sentence has changed completely. You're less certain by using might instead of will. And obviously you have to think about that. What is the message that you want to convey or get across? But I would really, think about, if you're going to use will in this example, really think about, how that feels or how somebody would receive that information. So this last example is actually an example of what we call hedging language. So hedging language is really making language soft, a little softer or more diplomatic sounding. So obviously it would be great if we could speak a foreign language like we do our own without making any mistakes, no mistakes in grammar or looking for the right word. But I think actually what's important to think about is some grammar mistakes and maybe not using perhaps the right words might not necessarily mean that your message is unclear or that it makes you sound unprofessional. By comparison, not using hedging language or softening language could actually affect the message and how professional you come across. It can therefore have a negative impact on your business relationships or how people see or react to you. Okay, so let's take a little glance back at the email we looked at earlier. So a few of you spotted those modals, which was great. So let's have a look now for the hedging language. So there are many phrases that you can use in the English language as hedging language. So this is just some examples of some. You've got, for example, let me know, or I'd really appreciate. So I really appreciate. Even the word a bit, a little bit, a bit. More time makes it softer, and yeah, say at the end of the week. So we're going to do the same as we did a moment ago. So we're going to have a little look at some hedging language that you could use. So this time the hedging language is in the sentence, and what I'd like you to do is, again, think for yourself. You don't have to put it in the chat. Just have a little think. If you can spot the hedging word or phrase. The first one. Now, hopefully you spotted it was actually a simple word, really changes the feel of the sentence. Unfortunately, something's come up and I have to cancel the meeting. Unfortunately, it just prepares the listener for bad news, well, bad news, that they know that something might not be going to plan. To be honest, I can't really agree to that. I'm sure you spotted it, to be honest. We're slightly over budget. Slightly, indeed. Yeah. It seems we need to get more people on board. And the word there is seems. Again, you really have to think about, obviously, the audience who you're talking to, but these phrases can really help, just to sound more polite and maybe get what you want from that person. So as a last activity for this, I want to round off. So I'll give you a little scenario. This time I do want you to post your reactions or ideas in the chat. So I'll just give you the scenario. So you're in a meeting and you want to interrupt your colleague who's taking a very long time to explain his point. His English isn't very good, but time is running out. You have another meeting to go to. So just one little phrase, how could you politely interrupt him? So yeah, please do post any ideas you have in the chat. Nice, yeah. So what we've got there, oh, it's going with, I'm afraid. Great, I'm afraid. There's a really nice way to interrupt. Sorry for interrupting, but sorry, could I? Excellent. Let's see if I can. Yeah, excuse me, but can we go on? Yeah. You could there, to be honest with you, was that one? That's a really nice one, but excuse me, that's quite soft. But what I would do maybe is just change the can with could there. Just makes it a little bit softer. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. Maybe, yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can always come back to things. Often in meetings, people run out of time and you can just say, refer to the fact that you can come back to this topic at a later date or, I don't know, plan in another meeting with that person. Indeed. Yeah, some really good reactions. I've just got one example here because there are so many, and I think maybe, I'm not sure this one came up, but another way of saying it would be, yeah, sorry, could I just come in here? Would be another way of coming in or interrupting. Okay, so we're going to do a little poll now. I'm quite curious to see what you think about hedging language. So just give me a second to open up the poll. Can't see it. Okay, so hopefully you've got a little pop-up on your screen. And the question is, hedging language helps you to 1, sound polite, 2, sound less direct, especially when you want something or are unsure about something, or 3, both 1 and 2. Can't see the poll, I'm not sure. See some coming in, not sure why somebody can't see the poll. Yeah, Sean or John, we can have a discussion on this in a moment, absolutely. I think 3. Just give it a couple of moments to see if everybody's managed to. I'm not sure why the poll hasn't popped up. It should pop up in your screen. Yeah, give it a few more seconds. Anybody to make a decision on what they want? I think we can close the poll now. So let's have a look. Now, hopefully you can see on your screens the results. So, okay, well, a lot of you said 1 and 2. Yeah, I would agree. I think it really both. Hedging language doesn't just help you to sound more polite, but it also changes the level of directness. And especially in situations where you want something from somebody or you're unsure if something's going to plan. And I'm pretty sure that happens quite a lot in our working lives, that we maybe need to communicate that we can't meet a deadline or we can't get a product to the customer on time or something like that. So hedging language, to recap, is vital when things aren't going to plan, to soften your language, but also to help you maintain those good relationships with colleagues and clients alike. Okay, so let's summarize. We've got plenty of time for discussions. I could see that some of you were asking to talk about that more in depth, so we will absolutely do that in a second. So yeah, let's just recap. So basically there is no quick fix, but one way or a couple of ways of helping you is with miscommunication is to use diplomatic language or softening language. You can also use clarifying language to just check in with one another, to check that you understand each other. And maybe for some of you that, you know, if you're on the telephone, that might be kind of awkward that you have to ask twice for repetition. But I think if you do it politely, yeah, hopefully that doesn't feel too awkward. Obviously, in a situation like that, if there's real miscommunication on the phone, then it may be better to try to agree to email one another the information or find another form of communication. And naturally, if that's an area that you struggle with a lot, I would advise doing a course to really improve your telephone language or really focus on what exactly the problem is there with the communication. Maybe it's also comprehending that person. As we mentioned before, a heavy accent. Maybe you're speaking to somebody from India or another part of the world. Yeah, really remember that culture and language is tied together. So we looked very quickly at the English language. It is a descriptive language. There are a lot of words. You don't have to use lots of words. You can be clear, but it is good to keep in mind that this is part of the language and part of the culture. So it all goes hand in hand. Be culturally sensitive. So really think about your own culture, reflect on your own culture. And I think a lot of you, but just looking at the chat and the feedback, are really aware of that and can do that. So think about your culture and about others' cultures. And yeah, think about how different they are. What is the communication style? And on the basis of that, you can really think about what you expect from one another or set the expectations. And I think as a rule of thumb, so an easy thing to remember is just meet in the middle. You can be clear without being too direct, and you can, yeah, get your message across without being too vague, but also being polite. And how do we do that? Well, we just touched on a couple of examples today, but those modals are really important. That's a big part of doing this. And we looked at some of that hedging language as well that can help you. But again, obviously you have to really think about the person that you're talking to. If you need to be clear, perhaps this is the third time that you've said no, naturally you can adjust your level of tone in each time you communicate with that person. So to sum up, be clear, be polite, but not vague. Easier said than done. But obviously there are lots of courses with us at Language Partners and at Axios, and Carola will tell you a bit about those at the end that you can sign up for if you're really struggling with these areas. Questions? So yeah, would anybody like to, we've got quite a lot of time, so if anybody would like to yeah, post anything they want to talk about or ask more about, please do. Is it right that the use of adverbs such as actually, basic, technical? Sina, so is it right that, well, I wouldn't say they ruin your speech, that they change it. You sound more natural, I think, by using them. Yeah, I would definitely say using these words makes you sound more natural. Actually comes up, but basically you could use, if you want to go over a point again, maybe you've said something, but you just want to really summarize the main points of what you're saying. Well, basically what I meant was A, B, C. Honestly, yeah, that's a good one. If you disagree with somebody, that's a really nice way of coming in. Honestly, yeah, I don't think it's going to work. And think, obviously a way of expressing your opinion. Got any other questions or discussion points?
Maybe we can go back to the slide with the poll, because just mentioned that that we need to look a bit more in depth on that.
Which side, Carola? This one?
Yeah, this one.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, yeah, if you've got any questions. I can't hear, I'm not sure why you can't hear. I think all our mics are on. Will the recording be shared? That's a question Carola has just popped up.
No, we won't share the recording, but the presentation will be shared. So after
the webinar, you will receive an email with the presentation of today's webinar.
Yes, so indeed, going back to the hedging language, yeah, please do ask if you've got any other questions about that. So as we mentioned, both are really correct here with regards to not just sounding polite. I think sounding polite can be with the modals, as we mentioned before, and hedging language are modals like might, but there are also these extra words and extra phrases. And it is a real art. It is difficult sometimes to figure out, you know, what's the best language to use. So I appreciate that I'm saying don't be vague, and yeah, but don't be direct. And it is sometimes very difficult to feel the differences. And my main advice would be if you're working with a certain culture quite a lot, that you have a lot of contact with them, it's probably a good idea to think about doing a short course to really understand that culture or understand yourself and your own language a bit more. Hopefully that helps a bit. Any other questions? Now, perhaps it was all clear.
yeah,
Okay, sorry, I was just talking to my colleague there because we realized that her mic's not working very well, so I will be rounding off. Yeah, okay. Well, I think I wasn't really sure how many questions we've got, but hopefully you've enjoyed this short webinar and got a bit of a feel for how we can use diplomatic or polite language when we're talking in a business environment with those different examples. And as I mentioned before, if you really are struggling and you have a lot of contact with non-natives or native speakers or people that don't speak your own language, please do go to our website to find out a bit more. As Carola mentioned, we will be sending you all the PowerPoint, so a PDF version of all of the slides. And at the end of the PowerPoint or the PDF, there is links to 2 specific courses that may be of interest to you. So one of them is the business English training, and there you will dive into more of the language that you can use. And there will also be an element of intercultural communication. If that's really what you want to focus on, so you're a bit more secure with the language that you're using, English, but it's really getting to understand what the big differences are between you and that other person. Then there's another link to a course with our sister company Actios, and they really focus on intercultural communication. So 2 courses that may be of interest to you there. And of course, we have lots more courses as well. So do visit our Language Partners website to find out more. Carola, I think I've mentioned everything. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. And yeah, maybe we meet again. Maybe I become your trainer, who knows? But have a lovely evening. And yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.